Hello and welcome. Even better, welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and I am here with Season 2 and this is the 54th episode of this podcast. This is part 2 of the story of the Yelahanka Nada Prabhus, and in this episode I will look briefly at the origins of the Mysore royals, the Wadiyars. Now, these two families are the most significant to our recent history, and by recent I mean from the 15th century. And to understand the history, it's necessary to understand the ecosystem and its influence on the events past. For example, it is coincidental that both these families came into prominence during the Vijayanagara kingdom and both had their careers experience a terrific rise when that dynasty fell. But before I continue with anything, please allow me pause to thank the Prestige Group whose corporate support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. All right, let's get going. In the last episode, I went over the origin story of the Gowda clan, at least one version of it, the legend of the family's migration from Alur near Kanchipuram. Now that was a great story to recount, to tell, but historians poke holes in it, understandably. The more plausible and favored theory is that they were Telugu-speaking people, but of local origin, already entrenched in local administration. Now, to claim that these Bandi Kappalu, which in Telugu loosely means people who arrived on bullock carts, boat people in Western parlance, simply appeared one day in the Deccan and got the Hoysala emperor to appoint them as local Rajas or Paligas right away, is to ask for a certain leap of faith. Nonetheless, legends thrive on aspects of truth, and it is clear that different members of the Mysore clan did establish themselves as Paligas of different localities around present-day Bengaluru, and like these, Tumukuru, Avathi, and importantly, Yelahanka. Now, the ecosystem in which the Gowdas and other Paligas grew to the administration of their principalities was set in the still prevailing fluidity of the period of change from the Hoysala to the Vijayanagara dynasty. During the early days of the Vijayanagara kingdom, the Hoysalas had all but faded from history, but their administrative systems lived on. The Hoysalas had divided their territories into Nadus and Simes, and the provincial governors, that's the people who rule the different principalities or clumps of principalities, were often drawn from within the royal family itself, allowing this family to keep direct control over the landmass. Their structure didn't disappear with the decline. It became a foundation for the Vijayanagara rule, but with a slight difference, which I'll get to in a second. Now, as the Hoysala power waned, their feudatories had shifted allegiance to the Vijayanagara kingdom. Some did so willingly, others had to be subdued. Now, the new empire had two main priorities: consolidating these lands and holding back invasions from the north. Now, controlling such a vast territory that the Hoysalas had built from the Tungabhadra all the way down to Rameshwaram certainly wasn't easy. Direct rule, that is by members of the family, wasn't possible anymore, especially in remote areas. So Vijayanagara used a different strategy from the Hoysalas. They encouraged ambitious people, often from known local dynasties or powerful political families, to settle and operate in these regions under imperial authority. These feudatories governed their provinces with some autonomy, but they all answered to a viceroy, the Mahamandaleshwara, who kept them in line. This system allowed Vijayanagara to expand without constant warfare. It absorbed all the former Hoysala lands, it kept the local power structure intact, and created an empire that dominated the Deccan for the better part of 2 centuries, if not a little more. Let's look at the geography of the land for a second. Between 1386 and 1530, the political map of southern Karnataka had undergone a change and started to look a little different. This was the period when the town of Mysore began to rise, a town that would later give its name to the kingdom and the state. To the immediate north lay Marusunadu, ruled by the Kannada-speaking Mysore Wadiyars chieftains, and they covered parts of modern Bengaluru and Tumukuru. To the south were the Tamil-speaking areas, Kongunadu, Choramandala and Pandya Desa. Due northeast, the Telugu chieftains ruled from Mulbagal. And to the west and the northwest were the Changalvas and the rulers of Malenadu, the hill country, the traditional domains of the Kodavas and the Tulu-speaking communities. This was the linguistic composition of the general area in the late medieval period, and by the time the Vijayanagara dynasty had come to rule, the region was home to these principal languages that existed along with the main or dominant language, Kannada. If you took a look at all the inscriptions, they reveal that the languages of record were Sanskrit, sometimes Prakrit, and Kannada. But while Kannada remained the principal and official language of the region and the one used most for public communications, other languages came into use officially alongside. The Choras and the Hoysalas used Tamil widely on inscriptions. And then following the advent of Vijayanagara, Telugu joined the mix as an official court language. And now the area was truly competent in a multilingual sense. But it was not during the late medieval period that the land became multilingual. It was from way before then. Multilingualism would have existed for generations before, from royal weddings, alliances, and very simply, the easy migration of southern people between the regions and the kingdoms of the south. That said, we should also consider that the principle of "it's not what you know but who you know" would have meant that royal or aristocratic patronage back then was important, and the ruling dynasties would have attracted people of their own backgrounds to move into the area. From that standpoint, it is not unlikely that the Telugu-speaking people, the Morosavokulu folks, like the Kempe Gowda family, would have found their way to the Mysore Deccan. In fact, while records show that the area around Alur near Kanchipuram, which is from where the Kempe Gowda family is said to have originated, was called Morosonadu, the area that they moved into also came to be known as Morosonadu, and that is the greater Bengaluru and Tumukuru districts. This multilingual ability was significant for more reasons than merely being proud of a cosmopolitan outlook. The ability to converse in a variety of languages was also important in the area because the new Morosonadu was always teeming with visitors. If you stop to think about it, for over 1,000 years the area had been at the crossroads of trade routes, the famous Kudalus. These would have mainly included the east to west coast movement of goods, the Tamil-speaking people from the east and the Kannada speakers from the west of the area, but it was also a rest stop and therefore a meeting point for people from everywhere else. So from the very earliest times that we understood our history, this land was traversed by the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, several other Middle East and Levant people, merchants from the north of India, from Sinhala and the Far East. And let's not forget that with them, people of faith of so many languages, the Jews, the Christians, the Muslim, the Buddhists, and the homegrown faiths, Jainism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and all their tributaries. When you consider the weight and volume of such cultural interactions to which the people of the Bengaluru region have always been exposed, we would easily redefine expressions like multiculturalism, multilingualism, and all other varieties of pluralism, and indeed, all other such isms. It does not take much to appreciate and understand that all this would have called for a cultural sophistication beyond your garden variety inclusivity. That said, the job of the Paligars, like Kempe Gowda, was not cultural pedagogy. They were not trying to set examples to society. They had a clear and difficult role to play, and this was to protect the land, improve infrastructure, and foster the finances of the state, collect taxes, pay the overlord their share. For the reasons I mentioned before, the status of the Paligars or the local chieftains under the Vijayanagara Empire was way more important than it was under the family-dependent Hoysalas. If the local chieftain was a good administrator, the region thrived, and the Kempe Gowdas certainly were good administrators. Not all Paligars were great though. As rulers or local rajas, they were responsible for everything. Someone you might call a plenipotentiary, one who could act as a true representative of the sovereign and therefore wield enormous power. A human greed being what it is, this centralized power did not always work in favor of the citizens any more than it does in our time today. One good example is how the merchants who were cobbled together in a large creed called the Ayavole 500 invited the Chora kingdom to come and take over from the last of the Ganga dynasty because the Palegars under the Ganga had become hard to control and they were attacking the holy cow of our history, trade. And now, let me take a well-deserved commercial break, and when I come back, more about the Kempe Gowda clan succession and the rise of the Wadiyars. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back, and let me talk about the Palegars, who were the vassals of the empire, and the rise of the Wadiyars. When Rana Baire Gowda and the clan established themselves in the general region around Nandidurga, Yelahanka and Tumakuru, the Morasunadu, they would have been completely in charge of the region. They would have been the Palegars. There was another name for Palegars, and this was Odeyars, spelled Odeyars. And I guess pronounced that way too, except that in the south, we use what linguists call the Dravidian phonological glide. So for example, in Kannada, when a word starts with I, you might hear a little Y sound before it, like ye instead of just E. Similarly, if a word begins with U or U, it often gets a soft W sound just before it, and it becomes a woo instead of just U. So this occurs naturally for the smooth flow of the spoken language. A couple of centuries later, Odeyar, or with its phonological glide, Wadiyar, became a family name for the chieftain of the small principality of Mysore. And it was only after 1881 that the king, Chamaraja X, adopted Wadiyar, spelled Wadiyar, as the official spelling of the name. So, the local chieftains were Odeyars or Palegars, and in the area was another family that were also appointed to the role of local chieftain, and this was the Wadiyars. Their origin story begins with the tale of 2 young men who travelled out of the Vijayanagara kingdom looking to settle in the Mysore region because it is said that the Vijayanagara kingdom was experiencing something of a very long and unusual famine. A chance encounter that these young men had led them to prominence and to establishing one of the greatest kingdoms in the whole of Indian history, the Mysore Wadiyars. I sort of recounted the story briefly in the closing episode of the previous season. If you haven't heard it, I urge you to, but let me summarize it here to save you some time. Back in 1399, during the reign of Harihara II of Vijayanagara, a local Palegar came to take over the small and barely significant territory of Mysore. Now, in the Vijayanagara parlance, a Palegar was not merely a feudal lord, a local administrator. He was importantly a military commander or even a rebel warlord who controlled fortified territories, which means forts, hill forts, and the like. And that's the meaning that's relevant to us here today in this context. After Vijayanagara's fall, many Palegars broke away, for instance, becoming independent warlords who resisted the Deccan Sultans and later the British. The Wadiyars were one such breakaway group in history, but they started their political career centuries before all that as Wadiyars to the Vijayanagara kingdom. The very first of those Palegars whom we can identify as the founder of the Wadiyar dynasty is a man called Yaduraya. The origin stories of the Wadiyars, like many dynastic origin stories, has rather unverifiable links to mythology, but that story of the 2 men is the more recent one and was recorded by early Bangalore chronicler Mark Wilkes, and that's what made it into historical accounts. Anyway, according to this version, the 2 young men were Vijaya and Krishna, left the Vijayanagara court in search of better opportunities in the south. Their journey brought them to a small fort town called Hadinaru, about 25 kilometers southeast of Mysore. The two young men stopped by a water tank to rest. When they did, they overheard a group of women from the Jangama sect lamenting the fate of a young maiden from their community. The brothers went over and asked them what happened, and the women explained that the girl, the daughter of a local Wadiyar who was ruling over 33 villages, was being forced into marriage. Her father, who was the local Wadiyar, was suffering from some sort of mental illness, and he had left her vulnerable, and the chief of Karugahalli, a man of very humble birth, had given the family an ultimatum: surrender Hadinaru and accept the marriage peacefully or face war. So left with no choice, he had agreed to this. And now the women were unhappy, as was the daughter. Hearing the story, the two young men, Vijaya and Krishna, chivalrously rose to the occasion and assured the women that they would protect the girl. Now this offer reached the family, and there was a meeting, and a plan was set into motion. First of all, they explained that the wedding feast would have to go on as scheduled, so which means the bridegroom's party arrived in Hadinaru for the wedding. But as the festivities were progressing, and as the Karugahalli chief and his men sat down to eat, the brothers and their allies from Hadinaru launched an attack. They ambushed their unsuspecting guests, killed them on the spot, and immediately marched on Naragahalli, taking the town by surprise. Victorious, they returned to Hadinaru in triumph. In gratitude, that young woman happily married Vijaya. Now Vijaya converted from Vaishnavism to Lingayatism and became the ruler of Hadinaru and Karugahalli, and by this account, he became Vijaya Raja or Yadu Raja, the first of the Wadiyars. Now there's a less dramatic version of the story, and it suggests that the Vijayanagara Emperor Harihara II himself installed Vijaya as his vassal in Mysore. Vijaya then assumed the titles of Raya or Raja and appended Wadiyar to his name, so therefore he became Yaduraya Wadiyar. Yaduraya Wadiyar's assumption of the position marked the beginning of one of the longest running dynasties in the world, and, even if purely in terms of titular succession, continues to this very day. While all this was going on, we know from inscriptions that I mentioned that Rana Baire Gowda, and according to the legend of his clan, his brothers, whether they were siblings or brothers in spirit, came to be in charge of other principalities. Now, while some literary sources place Jaya Gowda as the Nada Prabhu of Yelahanka, the inscriptions place a Baire Gowda at the scene and mention him as the Nada Prabhu. I went over this in some detail in the previous episode. Now, relying on literary accounts is a little hard because in much of this literature, the distinctions between fact and assumption and outright fiction sort of blurs, and a good part of it becomes hard to corroborate by any reasonable method. Now, while it is very tempting to pass off stories as recorded history, there's a decision to be made about what makes it to a historical narrative and what does not. And what can pass as history is often what is the most plausible or the least implausible. So in the matter of the succession of the Kempe Gowda family, following the tale of the family's migration is from legends and literature, and unfortunately there's not much there by way of reliable records to pass that off as real history. I'd like to quote Mark Wilkes, the earliest chronicler of Bangalore, a historian by default, and he said, "The golden age of India, like that of other regions, belongs exclusively to the poet. In the sober investigation of facts, this imaginary era recedes farther and farther at every stage of inquiry, and all we find is still the empty praise of the ages that have passed." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? For these reasons, if we apply a reasonably strict measure of proof to the years following the origin story of both the Wadiyars and the Kempe Gowda in terms of their succession, history is very unclear. So many historians move through this period rather quickly, pausing only for events that shed light on the customs of the time or the rise of the family to power, and of course, there's always the raising of armies and battles. And from that point of view, it is clear that the fortunes and the histories of the two families, both being vassals of the great Vijayanagara kingdom, would have intersected more than once. And it would be no surprise that they followed a similar career path in their early days. So whether Jaya Gowda was indeed the first Nada Prabhu of Yelahanka, or by the inscriptions I quoted, Baire Gowda was the first, or maybe they were the same person, the general consensus is that Jaya Gowda took the title Yelahanka Nada Prabhu and ruled for about 15 years in that position from 1418 to the time he passed in 1433. In that year, his son Gidde Gowda succeeded him. And this is where the family got the name Kempe Gowda. Gidde Gowda had no children, so by the family tradition, legends say that he made a vow to Kempamma, the consort of Bhairadeva, the family deity. If she blessed him with a son, he promised her that his descendants would thenceforth carry her name. Well, the goddess answered his prayers, and presently Gidde Gowda's wife bore him a son, and to keep their vow to the goddess, they named him Kempe Gowda, and from that time forward, all his successors took the name Kempe Gowda. Gidde Gowda ruled for 10 years from 1433 to 1443. That's the year that Kempe Gowda succeeded him. And he ruled for an unusually long reign of 70 years, from 1443 to 1513. And it was in 1513 that Kempe Gowda's son, Kempe Gowda I, succeeded his father to become the Yelahanka Nada Prabhu, and a few years later, the founder of the modern city of Bangalore. The history of Bangalore continues in the next episode with the story of how Kempe Gowda came to build the city. And as you can tell, our history is becoming palpably more recognizable. So stay tuned for this exciting, continuous story. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.